if you don't see the world truthfully, accurately, and interestingly, it doesn't matter what fairy tales you tell. Nobody believes them. So they have to arise out of an understanding of the real world. So the magic has to be rooted in the real, otherwise it's uninteresting.
Salman Ruždi ne voli da pripoveda jednostavne priče. U preobilju svog gustog romanesknog tkanja želi da obuhvati složene dimenzije vremena, stalne preobražaje sveta, komešanje istorije i ljudski život nesaglediv u svojim turbulentnim obrtima i grotesknim deformacijama. Čitanje njegovih knjiga tako postaje avantura putovanja kroz moguće i nemoguće svetove, kroz različite tradicije i kulture, kroz geografske i duhovne prostore seoba i egzila. On je pisac magijske stvarnosti. Podjednako je zaronjen u bajke, mitove i snove, kao i u današnji svet bez tačke oslonca i bez korena. Salman Ruždi, zahvaljujući svojim romanima koji su dobrim delom ispisali njegov život, jedan je od najpoznatijih pisaca našeg vremena. Rođen je 1947. u Bombaju u Indiji, a studije istorije završio je u Cambridgeu u Engleskoj. Za svoj drugi naslov, Deca ponoći, objavljen 1981. koji je odavno poneo epitet klasike, dobio je nagrade Buker, a zatim Buker nad Bukerima. Autori romana Sramota, Satanski stihovi, Mavrov poslednji uzdah, Tlo pod njenim nogama, Klovan Šalimar, Čarobnica iz Firence, 2 godine, 8 meseci i 28 noći. Objavljuje i knjige za decu i eseje. Pozornica njegove proze, kao i života, jesu i istok i zapad, ali i čitava planeta.
Salman Rushdie, I'm really glad to meet you in New York. I thought I would never meet you.
Well, it's easier. I'm glad you came all this way. But,
yes.
Yeah.
So you were born in Bombay, you were educated in England, and you live in New York. So where do you feel at home?
I mean, really, mostly now I feel at home here because I've lived here for a very long time. I mean, I've lived here for more than 16 years. And it's where I mostly live. So yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't feel American exactly, but I certainly feel like a New Yorker, And I mean, this is a city where most people who live here come from somewhere else, So everyone's an outsider. Of course, I lived in London for a very long time, and I still have a lot of my close family and old friends are there, so I also feel very attached there. And Bombay is different because, there's a sense in which your childhood home always has the feeling of home, But for me, that feels a little distant now, because the city has changed so much, and it's a different place.
So you don't have only one home, you have a lot of homes.
Yes, I think this is a modern phenomenon, I mean, this is such an age of migration, where so many people have, for different reasons, ended up in places which are not the place where they started out. And I think so many of us have roots in more than one place.
But do you think that it's good morality not to feel at home?
I think it's something interesting about being a writer, to feel a little bit out of place all the time, and I think it's actually one of the things that not only literature but that art in general can do, is to make you feel uncomfortable even when you are at home. It can look at the world that you know, and it can show it to you in a way that you haven't seen it, and make you feel a little strange even in your own hometown.
So you left India, your hometown, your first hometown. You left it at the age of 13, 14.
Well, I didn't really. I mean, I went to boarding school in England, but my family didn't leave, So I mean, I would go back and forth. I really only had the sense of leaving after I left university, and decided that I would live in London and not go back to live in India or Pakistan.
In fact, you spent your youth in England. Your first great success, Midnight Children, it happened in England.
It was written mostly in England.
Yeah, written,
yes.
and you became a writer in England, in fact.
Although, of course, that's a book which is a book of looking back to India, you know.
And the most difficult period of your life, fatwa, happened in England.
But also mostly in England, yes.
The most important things in your life happened in England, in fact.
Some of the best moments and some of the worst moments, yes.
What part of you is English?
Well, language for a start, you know. I still, you know, I've lived here 16 years. I still speak with an English accent, you know?
Yeah.
And my love of English literature is very deep, you know, and American literature, you know. And one of the great things about the literature of the English language is that it has now become the literature of so many places.
And to what literary tradition do you feel to belong?
I just wrote something about Shakespeare, and one of the things I tried to say is that one of the gifts of Shakespeare to the English language writers who follow him is that he showed that a work of literature doesn't have to be one thing, it can be many things at the same time. You know, so if you look at, say, Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 1 of Hamlet is a ghost story. Okay? Act 1, Scene 2 is about politics, it's intrigues at court. You know? Act 1, Scene 3 begins a romance because you meet Ophelia and she talks about Hamlet being in love with her. And then it's a ghost story again. And then it's a political story again. And then it becomes a murder story. And you know, there are comedy sequences, you know. And so what it shows is that you can do all of that. You know, you don't have to write a work which is just a political work or just a romantic work or just a ghost story. You can have all of it in one thing. And I think that was a very liberating thing. And I think, you know, a lot of English literature has followed from that, has been very free in form. And I like that, that ability to be many things at once, you know, in a single work.
It took you some time to become a writer.
Yes.
And you say, until you know who you are, you can't write. So at what moment did you realize who you were?
Well, I think what happened is that, yes, I think because I had left India and I was living in London, and I guess at that young age, that was confusing, you know. And in my first novel, my first published novel, Grimus, is a kind of fantasy novel, but it's also based on a Persian myth. But it kind of didn't work because it was an attempt to use, well, it was an attempt to use the form of a Western fantasy novel in order to rethink an Eastern fable, you know. And after I finished it, I thought, you know, I have to work this out. I have to work out who am I, where am I writing from, who is the person telling the story. You know, not only what is the story being told, but who is the person telling it to you, you know. And for that reason, I thought I would go back to a place much closer to my childhood experience.
And so you went to India?
So I went to India. I traveled for a long time. Basically, I took all the money I was given for the first novel and used it to travel in India until the money ran out. You know, and I was there for, I don't know, 7 months or something. You know, and I traveled in a very inexpensive way. I was traveling, you know, in sort of 16-hour bus rides across the country with chickens running around your feet. You know, so anyway, I learned a lot and I remembered a lot, and I felt in a way reconnected, you know, to a life that I had not lived for 8 years by then, or 10 years. I was born in the city of Bombay, once upon a time. No, that won't do, there's no getting away from the date. I was born in Dr. Narlikar's nursing home on August the 15th, 1947. And the time matters too. Well then at night. No, it's important to be more on the stroke of midnight, as a matter of fact. Clock hands joined palms in respectful greeting as I came. Oh, spell it out, at the precise instant of India's independence, I tumbled forth into the world. There were gasps, and outside the window fireworks and crowds. A few seconds later, my father broke his big toe, but that accident was a mere trifle when set beside what had befallen me in that benighted moment, because thanks to the occult tyrannies of those blandly saluting clocks, I had been mysteriously handcuffed to history, my destiny is indissolubly chained to those of my country. I, Salim Sinai, later variously called Snot-Nose, Stain-Face, Baldy, Sniffer, Buddha, and even Piece of the Moon, had become heavily embroiled in fate, at the best of times, a dangerous sort of involvement. And I couldn't even wipe my own nose at the time.
In fact, India made you a writer.
Yes.
There are sounds and perfumes and colors and stories India gave you.
Yeah.
But what is the most important thing that India gave you?
First of all, inexhaustible narrative. You know, there are just so many stories that you'll never get the chance to tell them all. That was one thing. The other thing, of course, is I became very interested in history. And I was born at an extraordinary moment. Independence of India happened 2 months after I was born. So this was a time of incredible transition. Because, of course, colonialism doesn't disappear on the day that the colonialists disappear. You know, the effects hang around. You know, and so I became, from my youngest times, interested in England and in the interconnection between England and India and what that had been like, and you know, who did what to whom, and. So history became a subject for me, and so it became quite natural for me when I was at university that I would study history. Because the study of history, I think, has really helped me in becoming the kind of writer that I became. You know, because I think a lot of my books, from Midnight's Children onwards, have taken the subject of history. You know, yes, sometimes they, you know, attacked that subject with elements of fantasy. You know, but that idea about how the individual is, how do we stand in relationship to the great events of our time? You know, that's to say, I mean, what happens in Midnight's Children is that there's this one individual, this boy Salim, who grows up against the backdrop of the historical events of the time, and then the question is, are you the master or the victim? You know, are you able to shape history? Are we as individuals able by our actions to shape history, or are we simply its victims? You know,
are we victims? What do you think?
I think we're both. Back in the 1960s, when I was young, there was a sense that yes, you could do that. You know, you could change the world. We had that idea, and I think that idea has somewhat been lost as the history has unfolded. Yes. You know, and so that's always been a subject for me. You know, and there are. I mean, the novel I wrote after Midnight's Children, Shame, is primarily about a kind of version of Pakistan. And in Pakistan, there's another issue, which is dictatorship. You know, and how do people deal with that? What do you do when you live under a dictatorship? In that case, at that time, a military dictatorship. But frankly, the civilian governments in Pakistan have not been that much more liberal than the army. So everywhere you go, you find this conflict between the public and the private, you know, and for me that's become really a big subject, because I think the gap between public life and private life has become tiny, non-existent almost.
In the latest novel, 2 years, 8 months and 28 nights, there is not a lot of politics and history, I should say. And you like to say that this is your funniest novel, and I should say this is your most fantastic novel.
I went back, if you like, to the beginning. I went back to these stories that I had heard as a child originally in India, these sort of so-called wonder tales, you know, of which The 1001 Nights is the most famous, but there are many other such collections. You know, there's a collection of animal fables called the Panchtantra, which is about a couple of wicked jackals and other animals. If you grow up there, that is the first literature that you have around you, you know, and for me, that was again something helpful, because it showed me that stories could be like that. That, you know, that even though we all know that carpets don't fly, you know, but in stories they can fly, you know, and they can take you to interesting places, you know. So that idea, the truth in art, is not the same thing as naturalism. Truth of literature is more this other imagined truth, you know, and the reason why the reader responds to it as truth is because it's true about human beings. It's true about human nature. You know, it tells you what we are like as people and what we do to each other, and even if we get there on a flying carpet. Very little is known, though much has been written, about the true nature of the jinn, the creatures made of smokeless fire. Whether they are good or evil, devilish or benign, such questions are hotly disputed. These qualities are broadly accepted, that they are whimsical, capricious, wanton, that they can move at high speed, alter their size and form, and grant many of the wishes of mortal men and women, should they so choose, or if, by coercion, they are obliged to do so, and that their sense of time differs radically from that of human beings. They are not to be confused with angels, even though some of the old stories erroneously state that the devil himself, the fallen angel Lucifer, son of the morning, was the greatest of the jinn. For a long time, their dwelling places were also in dispute. However, the most eminent commentators long asserted what we now know to be true, that the jinn live in their own world, separated from ours by a veil, and that this upper world, sometimes called Baristan, or fairyland, is very extensive, though its nature is concealed from us.
Do you think fantasy is a good way to talk about the reality?
I do. You know, I think one of the things, when I was young, when I was at boarding school and college, I read an enormous amount of science fiction and fantasy, an enormous amount. And the thing I liked about it is that it's a very good vehicle for ideas. You know, if you want to talk about philosophical ideas or whatever, science fiction can be a really brilliant way to do that. You know, and the best science fiction does that very well. You know, the things that in the end made me stop reading science fiction was two things. One is that apart from the very best writers, apart from Ray Bradbury and Kurt Vonnegut and Arthur C. Clarke and people like that, who are wonderful writers, a lot of the quality of the writing is very bad. You know, the prose is not particularly beautiful. You know? And the other thing is there's a real problem in the depiction of women. The women were all either people in laboratory coats being technicians, or they were kind of babes, scantily dressed and very sexually desirable, and that was it. There was nothing else women could be. And it just got dull, you know, to read a literature in which one gender was so completely, so badly depicted.
So your female characters are very strong.
Well, I think it's because, you know, I mean, I have 3 sisters and no brothers. My extended family of, you know, aunts and cousins and so on, there are many, many more women than men. So I grew up in a very female world in a way, you know. So it's not unnatural for me, therefore, to look at, and all these women are, I mean, very argumentative, tough, strong-minded, you know, difficult women.
Yeah.
In my family. So they all talk a lot. And so if you want to get listened to, you better speak up. You know? Yeah. And so it's been natural for me to have these important female characters in many of my books. You know? And I mean, this book has, you know, really the hero of the book is a woman.
She's going to save the world.
Yes. And,
I like it.
Yeah. So, and it seemed natural. It seemed right to do it that way. You know, much more interesting than to have some man doing it.
Those male characters, they are rather anti-heroes.
Yes, I think I have very few actual heroes in the way of male characters. Well, because, you know, men are like that. You know? I mean, the women are kind of broken and damaged as well. You know, but I think it's true that the men are more anti-heroic than the women. You know, I think these days we think about heroes differently. You know, we don't think about heroes as knights in shining armor. You know, we think about them as people surviving what the world throws at them. You know, and coming out sort of in one piece.
there is the world of jinn, you're very fond of.
Well, the jinn, you know, what I like about the world of the jinn is that it's completely separate from any kind of religious, supernatural world. You know, that's to say, it has nothing to do with paradise.
They are supernatural.
They're supernatural, but they're not divine.
Yes,
you know, they're not
yes.
like angels.
Yes.
You know, angels are there in the service of God, etc. You know, and angels assume the existence of angels assumes the existence of paradise, and the existence of paradise assumes the existence of hell. Right? So then you're into a whole religious thing. The thing about the jinn is that they just live in this place, Paristan, which is usually translated as fairyland. You know, so they're just in another world, which is not like our world, but which doesn't presume the existence of a divine world. You know, so in that sense, they're quite secular, supernatural creatures, and that's attractive to me. And they're you know, they're really wicked, and that's attractive too.
Yes, and there is also Ibn Rushd, philosopher from 12th century, and I learned that your family name, Rushdie, comes from Ibn Rushd.
Yes, it does, because I only discovered this. I didn't know this as a child. You know, I discovered this sort of when I was going to college, kind of. My parents told me that what had happened was that my father had chosen this family name, Rushdie, because of his admiration for the philosophy of Ibn Rushd, who's known in the West as Averroes. You know, he's a great scholar of Aristotle, and actually the way in which some of the work of Aristotle has survived in the West is it was translated back out of his translations because the originals were lost. You know, so. But he wanted to introduce Aristotle's ideas, the ideas of logic and reason. And to introduce those into Islamic thought. In philosophy, there's always a kind of argument, you know, and the other side of the argument had actually been expressed almost 100 years before Ibn Rushd by a Persian philosopher, Al-Ghazali, who was much more conservative in his thinking.
Evoke this whole dispute between Ibn Rushd and Ghazali in this book.
Yes, so I thought, because that dispute between conservative and progressive thought, you know, in a way we're still having that argument, you know.
It's very actual.
We're actually still, that argument is here every day, you know, in the world. And so I thought, to begin with these two men from long ago, you know, who in a way began this argument, and that argument between enlightened thought and you know, reactionary thought, you know, if you like, orchestrates what happens in the book. You know, because the jinn, in a way, get involved in the argument, you know, and start taking sides, and so there follows a great war. And of course, the strange thing is that when I started writing this book, which was now many years ago, none of us had ever heard words like ISIS. You know, we didn't know anything about that. There was no such thing. You know, so by the time I finished the book, the thing that I made up had come into being, and that was very alarming. Instill fear, Ghazali told him. Only fear will move sinful man towards God. Fear is a part of God, in the sense that it is that feeble creature, man's appropriate response to the infinite power and punitive nature of the Almighty. One may say that fear is the echo of God, and wherever that echo is heard, men fall to their knees and cry mercy. In some parts of the earth, God is already feared. Don't bother about those regions. Go where man's pride is swollen, where man believes himself to be godlike. Lay waste his arsenals and flesh pots, his temples of technology, knowledge, and wealth. Go also to those sentimental locations where it is said that God is love. Go and show them the truth.
But what's strange, you say you're atheist, but you know really well the religion, and precisely Islam, and you even studied origins of Islam at university.
Well, I mean, I just think, yes, I mean, as an individual, I feel no need for religion at all. I just don't think it explains the world in a way that I'm interested in. you know. But here it is, you know, here it is sitting in the middle of the room. You know, and so if you're a writer trying to deal with the world as it is, you can't avoid the subject, you know, because there it is in the middle of the room. And it's very odd to me because the world as it was when I was at university was a very largely secularized world. I mean, not just in the West, you know, everywhere. The idea that religion would return to this central position, you know, and that we would all have to deal with it all the time, seemed impossible. But we were all wrong about that, and this is what happened. And so it means that even people, writers who, as people, you know, are not religious, have to deal with the subject of religion because it's such a huge subject. I wish I didn't. I mean, I would really like to write a book that had nothing to do with religion.
But how did you become atheist?
Well, I mean,
when?
Because it seems a completely sensible thing to me. I mean, in fact, I mean, my family was not very religious. You know, I mean, my father was absolutely not religious, and my mother not very. My mother's religion was like, don't eat pork. You know, that was about it. The extent of Islam in our house was that we didn't eat pig. You know, but otherwise, we were brought up in a very non-religious kind of secularist atmosphere, you know. And again, in India at that time, that was not so unusual, you know. And I mean, now also in India, these sectarian sentiments have become much stronger than they used to be. The world has changed, and not for the better, I think.
Yes, and the Satanic Verses, it's the most atheist book of yours, and the book that brought you a lot of problems, really, including fatwa, sentence to death. So did you think that your secular take on Islam could provoke to that extent the Muslim world?
No, and I mean, it wasn't the Muslim world, it was unfortunately the Ayatolah Homeini, but who I don't see as a representative of much except a certain kind of fascism that took hold in Iran. And it was my misfortune to attract his attention, I guess, you know. But I mean, I know any number of Muslim readers who read the book with enjoyment, you know, so it's not there's no universal view, is what I'm saying. So, but yeah, I mean, it was and of course 90% of the Satanic Verses is not about religion at all. You know, and most of it is a novel about immigration. It's about people from South Asia coming to London, and about that act of migration and the transformations in the self that it creates. It's about two people who are both actors who come to London, and it's their story, you know. And the religion stuff, it takes place in 2 chapters of the novel as dream sequences, you know. So it's very, I mean, in a way, it's very secondary to the book.
Yes, but when you have Angel, whose name is Gabriel, and when he's torn between belief and disbelief in God, so...
but you see, the character in the book, who is called Jibril, which is Indian version of Gabriel, and who begins to think of himself as being some kind of supernatural entity. First of all, he's quite clearly in the novel losing his mind. You know, he's going mad, and he's having these dreams in that very unstable condition. You know, so these are the dreams of a madman. You know, and in the novel, the religion is not called Islam, the place it takes place in is not called Makkah, the prophet is not called Muhammad. You know, it's many steps removed from actuality, but of course it was not even read, it was just described in a way that portrayed it as something that it wasn't. But what is right is that the view of religion in the book is a dissident view. You know, I mean, my view is that, you know, if you had stood on the mountain next to the prophet, would you have seen the angel? Because the angel is described in Islamic history, the angel is described as very big. The angel is described as he stood on the horizon and filled the sky. You know, that's a big angel. So if you were standing next to the prophet, would you see the angel? My view is probably not. Right?
Yes.
and so then what's happening? Because it's clear that the prophet is not being insincere. He's telling you what he sees, you know, but you wouldn't see it. So then it becomes a question of an internal event rather than an external event, you know. And so the question is, what is that phenomenon? You know, because it's clearly not an objective phenomenon, because otherwise we would all see the visions, we would all see the, you know, and because we don't, it's something internal, and the question is how to approach that. So the idea of the novel, of those chapters of the novel, was to think about revelation, but from the point of view of somebody who is not a believer, you know. And so, of course, there are people who didn't like it, and my view is tough.
Da knjiga može da posjeduje moć oružja, pokazala je takozvana afera Ruždi. Ne pamti se da je jedan roman izazvao toliku političku pometnju širom sveta, čak i prekid diplomatskih odnosa između Velike Britanije i Irana, kao što je to bio slučaj sa satanskim stihovima. Godinama kasnije, Ruždi će napisati memoarsku prozu Joseph Anton, u kojoj će opisati svoj život pod fatvom koji je započeo 14. februara 1989. Tada je iranski duhovni vođa Ajatolah Homeini izrekao smrtnu kaznu protiv njega zbog huljenja islama, Muhameda i Kurana u romanu Satanski stihovi i pozvao muslimanski svet da izvrši presudu. Od tog dana Ruždi će živeti u najvećoj ilegali. Čuvaće ga mnogobrojni agenti britanske tajne policije i specijalnih službi. Narednih 9 godina, zbog kontroverzi koje su pratile roman, ubijeno je na desetine ljudi širom sveta. Među njima i japanski prevodilac satanskih stihova. Iran će se 1998. zvanično ograditi od fatve, ali je neće povući, jer to može da učini samo onaj koji ju je obznanio, Ajatolah Homeini, koji više nije živ, te i danas Ruždi živi u posebnom režimu života. I ovo snimanje se odvijalo u specijalnim uslovima, a bila je neophodna i zvanična izjava da u intervju neće biti političkih pitanja.
Did fatwa shake your confidence as a writer?
Oh, well, I mean, those were bad years, yeah. I mean, you know, but I think it's the other way around. I think that writing really rescued me. You know, I think it gave me the place to go in order to regain a sense of myself, you know. And the first book I wrote after it was actually it's a children's book, it was a young adult's book, Harun and the Sea of Stories. And strangely, because it was a book written in a very dark moment of my life, it's probably my most cheerful book. It's kind of, you know, it has a fully formed happy ending.
The question you pose very, very often in your books is the question of identity. Identity which is fluid and open, and your heroes, they float between different identities.
Yeah.
So do you think that's an important question today?
Oh, I think yeah, and I think more and more important, because now there's a whole kind of politics around the subject of identity. You know, I mean, identity politics has become a big thing. You know, my sense of identity is that we are many things. You know, any one of us is a whole bag of different kinds of individual wrapped into one body, you know, so that our behavior is different all the time. You know, the way in which we behave to our children is not the way in which we behave to our employer. You know, the way in which we behave to our lover is not the same as the way in which we behave to our friends. So it seems to me, in this sort of, let's say, post-Freudian world, we know that identity is fragmented and fractured and multiple. That you know, there are 40 or 50 ways in which anybody can describe themselves, and all of them are true. You can describe yourself as short or tall, or bad-tempered, or overweight, or whatever. You know, there are many, many ways in which we can express our identity, and all of those identities put together are our identity. Yet in the world today, there's an attempt to make us all simplify ourselves, to simplify our identities, you know, into being let's say, Western or Islamic, you know, to be Serb or Croat. You know, I mean, that's to say there's a desire to put people into narrower categories, you know,
and you think that hybridity and mixture and what is impure,
it's better for us.
It's better for us.
It's better for us, you know, because the more complicated the way in which you understand yourself, the easier it is to find things that you and other people have in common, you know. And the more you simplify yourself into being just one thing, the harder it is to do that, and so it increases the possibility of conflict, you know. And you know, the history of the world shows us this right now. And so for me, one of the real values of literature is that it shows us that we are complicated, contradictory, many-sided, not simple people. We are not simple people. Who is he? An exile, which must not be confused with or allowed to run into all the other words that people throw around. Émigré, expatriate, refugee, immigrant, silence, cunning. Exile is a dream of glorious return. Exile is a vision of revolution. Elba, not Saint Helena. It is an endless paradox, looking forward by always looking back. The exile is a ball hurled high into the air. He hangs there, frozen in time, translated into a photograph, denied motion, suspended impossibly above his native earth. He awaits the inevitable moment at which the photograph must begin to move and the earth reclaim its own. These are the things the Imam thinks. His home is a rented flat. It is a waiting room, a photograph, air.
The other of your topics are migrations and transformation and exile.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know...
And that's the world we live in.
Well, it's a world of great dislocation. You know, I mean, it's a time of great dislocation. When
So you see the people from Asia coming to Europe, and you read the newspaper, there are some rich people from Europe, they're going to Australia to feel more secure. So the world is changing.
The world is changing. And I mean, I think this is this whole subject, the whole subject of the refugees is obviously a colossal subject, and I don't pretend to have all the answers to it. Obviously, there are solutions. For example, in order to stop people running for their lives, you have to stop them wanting to run for their lives, which means you have to solve the problem from which they are running. You know? And in the case of what's happening in Syria and Iraq, obviously that's one of the big engines of the refugee problem. And you know, it needs to be resolved so that people don't feel the need to flee. Yeah? And I mean, there's so many questions. Why are the Arab countries not taking the refugees who speak their language? You know, why is it that all around the Gulf, where there are states where people speak Arabic, where have the same belief system and so on, why are those the people who are not taking anybody at all? You know, whereas it falls to Western Europe to take everybody. So I think there's a whole series of very complicated arguments to be had here, but it's clear that you can't just go on pouring millions of people every year into Europe and expect it to have no problem. You know, at the same time, what do you do with them? You know, so yeah, I'm glad I don't have to solve the problem.
Is today's world a product of religious turmoil?
I think it's a very big problem. I think it's a very big problem. You know, and I mean that's why I keep coming back to writing about it, because I mean, in a way, finding the way, in this book, I wanted to find a way of writing about this turmoil without getting into the question of what's on the news every day, you know? And so it became like a fable about the kind of conflicts, religious and moral and regional conflicts that there are now everywhere, but turned into a kind of fairy tale because it's a way of, it was a way of separating it from something that would be too immediate. You know, the problem of writing about something that's very, very contemporary is that the world changes very, very fast. You know, the world moves on at extreme speed. And you could find your book to be irrelevant and outdated, you know, months after it comes out, if it's too closely associated with current events. You know, so Question is how to find the universal in the particular. Who cares now about Napoleon's Russian campaign, you know, of 1812? But we still all read War and Peace, you know, because the book has transcended the events which inspired it, you know, and so that's the question. And the question of literature is to how to make something that endures. One of the things that really has pleased me about what's happened with Midnight Children.
But let's say something more about Midnight Children. It's a book I love. So there are two parallel stories or histories.
Yeah.
The first one is a history about modern India, the birth of the modern India.
Yeah, yeah.
And the second one is the intimate history of a
this
boy
kid, yes.
and children who are born at the same moment.
Yes.
So those children, they are endowed by magical powers, but they start losing those powers in front of the history.
Yeah, they become a kind of metaphor
Yes.
for the country, you know.
Yes.
And initially, you know, I didn't think it would be like that, because when I first thought about the book, I hadn't really thought about this huge historical dimension. You know, I thought that I'm going to write a novel about childhood. You know, and that was the starting point. Was I'm going to write a novel about childhood, and I'm going to base
about
it
your childhood in
well,
India. So you took your life as a starting
it
point.
will come out of the. At least it will be drawn from the memory of my own childhood. You know, because actually, I mean, Salim is not me, and his friends are not mine, and so on. But you know, it comes out of that world in which I grew up. That world immediately after the end of children to grow up in a free country for 250 years. You know, so.
And those children, they share hopes and errors of the
Yeah, but
revolution.
initially I thought it would just be about that. And then at a certain point, I had this idea that they would be born at the same time as the country. You know, and I remember being quite frightened of the idea, because I thought, on the one hand, I think it's quite a good idea, but on the other hand, it just enormously expanded the novel. You know, it meant that the novel would have to be a much bigger scale than I had thought about. And I was, you know, I was a very young, inexperienced, unsuccessful writer at the time, and I wasn't at all sure of my ability to do it, you know, but I could see that it was a thing to do, you know, and in the end, it took me a very long time. It took me, you know, a little more than 5 years to write it, and a part of that is because I was having to learn how to write it, you know, while I was writing it.
I think that is a sentence from this book. You say, man should know what to leave behind him and what to hold on to. So you left Salman Rushdie, you left a lot of things behind you.
Yeah.
But what is the thing you hold on to?
Well, you know, I'll tell you physically what there is. When I was 1 day
And
old...
metaphorically also, please.
Yes, but the two are the same. When I was 1 day old, one of my father's closest friends gave me, as the 1 day old baby, a little block of silver, it's about this big, 1 inch high, on which is engraved the unpartitioned map of India. You know, because this was before the partition, you know, when I was born,
Yes.
2 months before. So the map of India in this little block of gold, silver, sorry. And I carry that with me wherever I go.
Really?
I still, yeah, it's the thing I bring with me wherever I go. And that's who I most essentially am. I'm a person from unpartitioned India. India before it was divided, you know. Really my parents' India, in a way, because in those days, Pakistan, nobody thought about it, you know, and that part of what is now Sindh and Punjab and so on, which are now West Pakistan, or now Pakistan, were simply parts of India, you know. And that sense of South Asia as one thing, not as this divided, quarrelsome thing, but as one thing, is important to me. So I think, you know, I've traveled a lot around the world, you know, as you were saying,
Really? Yeah,
you know, I've been in Londoner, I'm now a New Yorker, but I think at the bottom, underneath all that, I'm the boy from Bombay.
If you look at that map of the world, there is India, England, New York is there. So you made the half of the circle.
The planet, yes.
And so how would you like to complete that circle?
Well, the thing is, I find great similarities, you know, because I think I see myself as a very urban writer. I think if I had to describe myself, I would say that I'm a writer of the big city. What I think about Bombay, London, New York is that I can see enormous similarities. You know, I think the life of the great city is alike. You know, I think if you're used to, if you grow up as a child of the big city, it's very easy to adapt to another city because you know how the city works.
But what is your American life like?
Oh, you know, first of all, New York is not like America. You know, I mean, New York is a small, very intense, very liberal space. You know, yeah. I mean, it's very, very physically small. You know, I mean, but the number of people here is
big.
I mean, and also the number of people here during office hours doubles. So you have, I don't know what, 8 million people, something like that, living on Manhattan Island. But between 9 to 5, the population is double because of people coming into work. So it's incredibly intense. And of course, it's a very, very progressive-minded, liberal-minded little part of the country.
And this is here you want to complete your circle.
I just feel like I
journey.
fit. I feel like I fit. You know, I think it's full of oddball people like me.
Yes, and one last question. One of your characters, he says, to understand just one life, you have to swallow the world, the whole world. So is that the way a writer does? I think
it's one of two ways. You know, I think there's two kinds of ways of writing really well. You know, and one is a Jane Austen way, where you take one little thread, you know, so to speak, one hair from the head of the goddess, you know, and you just turn it in the light, and you see what happens. That one very delicate, beautiful thing becomes your book, you know. And the other is to try to write encyclopedias, to try and put as much of the world in as you can put in, you know. And that's a temperamental thing. There are some writers who are of one kind and some who are of the other kind, you know. And I guess...
And how do you write?
I guess my temperament is the encyclopedia temperament, you know. So I always thought, try and put as much in, you know, try and capture as much of reality as you could possibly get into the pages of a book.
And why do you write?
Because what else would I do? You know, what else would I got? There's nothing else I can do, so I may as well do this. Yes, here we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's great. That was good.